truth is the most convincing story that maps onto reality, and that's why the central narrative is falling apart.
Right now in the United States, people should not be walking around with masks.
We must see the central narrative for the fiction that it is. We are Americans.
While elections are sometimes messy, this was a secure election.
The founders began the fight for human liberty and self-governance, and it's up to us to finish the job.
I'll tell you what, we are in a truth emergency right now.
This is the end game.
It's Tuesday, June 4th, 2024, the 1,231st day of dystopia. I'm your moderator, Chris Paul. Let's be reasonable. A warm welcome and hello to all of you listening through a paid subscription at imyourmoderator.substack.com. With a paid subscription, you get the ad-free experience. You can join in the conversation over on Substack, and you are invited to participate in the interactive live streams every Wednesday afternoon. You can become a paid subscriber for as little as $50 a year or $5 a month. And if you can't, or you simply don't want to, continue listening to the podcast for free on Substack or a wide variety of podcast platforms, and of course, Rumble. All I ask is that you share it with your friends. You can find the links to the podcast, the writing, the social media, and the merch site by visiting linktree.com/I'mYourModerator. Anyone who understands the roller coaster we've been on these past few years knows we haven't reached the end yet, and there may still be hard times to come. And as we add $1 trillion to the national debt every 100 days, we could be headed for some shaky financial times. If you're like me, you're figuring out how to diversify and make sure some seeds are planted for whatever may come. And that's one of the many reasons I think Bitcoin is part of our future. But it's not only about money. Bitcoin looks to be a critical part of the next generation of technology, communications, energy, verification, and even national defense. I'd encourage everyone to do their research and do it now. And if you're convinced of the likelihood that Bitcoin is an essential part of our future, then you'll need an on-ramp. I recommend River. River empowers you to grow your portfolio without any unwanted surprises and eliminates third-party custodians, putting you in control of your assets. Open an account with no minimum purchase requirement. You can get your Bitcoin journey started with just $1. Visit partner.river.com/reasonable to create your River account today. That's partner.river.com/reasonable. Now, I know that many of you out there understand the need to diversify assets, or maybe you're looking to protect your retirement savings, but you're not quite there yet on Bitcoin, and you feel better about precious metals. I get that too. I think going in multiple directions is wise, and I do that myself. And when it comes to buying precious metals, you want to be working with a good company, and that's why I've partnered with Goldco. Goldco is a 6-time Inc. 5000 winner, 2022 Company of the Year, and they've helped people like you and me place over $2 billion in gold and silver. And I have gotten silver from Goldco. And right now they're offering my supporters up to $10,000 in bonus silver while supplies last. Don't pass this offer up. Go to reasonablegold.com now. This is your opportunity to protect you and your family from an out-of-control government before it's too late. So don't wait a second longer. Take action today. Click on the link in the podcast notes or go to reasonablegold.com now and get your free gold kit, your free IRA kit. You'll be glad you did. Okay, so at the beginning of the year, I said there would be a few topics we would focus on throughout this year. Geopolitics, elections worldwide, election integrity in the United States, the pending financial collapse, whatever that's going to look like, and the future of currencies as the dollar is diminished worldwide, as the BRICS alliance grows, as Bitcoin begins to take a more prominent position on the financial landscape. And so today I want to do some catching up on elections around the world. In the last few weeks, we have had elections in Iceland, in Lithuania, in South Africa, in India, in Mexico. And today I want to focus on Mexico and India. And if we're able to then get to South Africa, then Lithuania, then Iceland, wonderful. I don't think it is likely we will get that far. Let's begin with the global regime's American paper of record, the old gray lady, the New York Times. This is the headline from Monday. Another milestone in Mexico. Its first Jewish president. Mexico elected its first Jewish president over the weekend, a remarkable step in a country with one of the world's largest Catholic populations. Yet, if it is a watershed moment for Mexico, it has been overshadowed by another one. President-elect Claudia Sheinbaum will also be the first woman to lead the country. There's another reason there's been relatively little discussion of her Judaism. Miss Sheinbaum, 61, rarely discusses her heritage. When she does, she tends to convey a more distant relationship to Judaism than many others in Mexico's Jewish community, which stretches back to the origins of Mexico itself and today numbers about 59,000 in a country of 130 million people, really defying the odds there. Of course, I know where I come from, but my parents were atheists, Miss Sheinbaum told the New York Times in a 2020 interview. I never belonged to the Jewish community. We grew up a little removed from that. Ms. Sheinbaum's parents were both leftists and involved in the sciences, and she was raised in a secular household in Mexico City in the 60s and 70s, a time of considerable political agitation in Mexico. The way she embraces her own Mexican identity from a very young age is rooted in science, socialism, political activism, said Tessie Schlosser, a historian and director of the Mexican Jewish Documentation and Research Center. And thank goodness they have one of those. Additionally, Miss Sheinbaum's story of migration as the descendant of Jews who emigrated to Mexico in the 20th century, quote, does not give any political capital, end quote, in a political society where candidates often allude to their mestizo or indigenous roots, Miss Schlosser said. Ms. Sheinbaum's father, Carlos Sheinbaum Yoselevitz, a businessman and chemical engineer, was son of Ashkenazi Jews who fled Lithuania in the early 20th century. Her mother, Annie Pardo Simo, a biologist and professor emeritus at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, is the daughter of Sephardic Jews who fled Bulgaria before the Holocaust. But while Ms. Sheinbaum has downplayed her ties to Judaism, her origins have not gone entirely unnoticed, revealing currents of xenophobia and anti-Semitism persisting beneath the surface in Mexican politics. And yes, that must have been a massive driving force in Mexico as a woman of that minority group to whom that racism and bigotry is directed, just became president of the nation, despite that minority group representing 1 in every 2,200 Mexicans. The anti-Semitism must be crippling. After emerging last year as a presidential contender, Ms. Sheinbaum faced birther attacks, questioning whether she was born in Mexico or even Mexican. Among those leading the attacks against her was Vicente Fox, a conservative former president who called Ms. Sheinbaum a Bulgarian Jew. Ms. Sheinbaum responded by releasing a copy of her birth certificate, detailing her place of birth as Mexico City. I'm 100% Mexican, the proud daughter of Mexican parents, she said. Still, Ms. Sheinbaum's candidacy has cast attention on Mexico's Jewish community and the array of reactions to her political ascent from Mexican Jews. While Jewish people first arrived in Mexico in 1519 at the time of the Spanish conquest and continued arriving in colonial times to escape persecution in Europe, their numbers grew considerably in the 20th century. A large number of Jews in Mexico trace their origins to Syria, while others came from other parts of the former Ottoman Empire or Europe. Mexico remains predominantly Christian with nearly 100 million Catholics and 14 million Protestants, according to a 2020 census. But Mexican Jews have long figured prominently into public life, including broadcast journalists such as Jacobo Zabludovsky and Leo Zuckerman, writers like Margot Glantz and Enrique Krauss, and politicians like Solomon Chertorivsky, a progressive who mounted a losing bid this year for mayor of Mexico City. Sabina Berman, a Jewish writer and journalist, is among the high-profile Mexican Jews who have sided with Ms. Sheinbaum, calling her disciplined and a great candidate. But such endorsements have been far from unanimous, reflecting the skepticism among some in Mexico's Jewish community about the leftist political leanings of Ms. Sheinbaum, a protege of the combative current president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador. In one example, Carlos Alazraqui, a prominent advertising executive, said that Ms. Sheinbaum was absolutely resentful toward people of means because of being raised by parents he called communists. The envy she has toward the middle class on up is impressive. He said she's vindictive. More broadly, Ms. Sheinbaum also faced criticism during the campaign, accused of exploiting religious figures to connect with Catholic voters. After she met with Pope Francis, her opponents questioned her beliefs and seized on previous images of her wearing a skirt bearing the image of the Virgin of Guadalupe, a hugely important figure in Mexican Catholicism. "We both had a meeting with the Pope," said Xochitl Gálvez, her top rival in the race, at a recent debate. "Did you tell His Holiness how you used a skirt with the Virgin of Guadalupe even though you don't believe in her or in God?" Pressed after such attacks to say whether she believes in God, Ms. Sheinbaum said, "I'm a woman of faith and of science," and accused Ms. Galvez of disrespecting the separation of church and state, a central tenet to Mexico's political system. A more nuanced picture of Ms. Sheinbaum's identity emerges from some of her own statements in the past. "I grew up without religion. That's how my parents raised me," Ms. Sheinbaum told a gathering organized by a Jewish organization in Mexico City in 2018. But obviously the culture, that's in your blood. So essentially, because she is Mexican, she is Catholic and Christian by proxy. And as a former atheist, I think I am justified in wondering exactly where her faith comes from without a belief in God. Perhaps she believes that her faith in science serves all the same functions without believing in things that men just made up. Because if there's one thing we know, it's that all of science is totally real. She told Arturo Cano, who wrote her biography, that she observed Yom Kippur and other Jewish holidays with her parents, but that it was more cultural than religious. Like other secular Jews in Mexico, Ms. Sheinbaum has also said she wasn't pushed to marry within the faith. It wasn't like, "You have to marry a Jew," which happened with my mother, Ms. Sheinbaum told The Times. Writing in a Mexican newspaper, Ms. Sheinbaum said her paternal grandfather left Europe because he was, quote, "Jewish and communist," end quote. And her maternal grandparents escaped, quote unquote, Nazi persecution. "Many of my relatives from that generation were exterminated in the concentration camps," she said in a letter to the editor of La Jornada from 2009, in which she also condemned what she described as, quote unquote, "the murder of Palestinian civilians" during an Israeli bombing campaign in the Gaza Strip. Since the war broke out there last year, Ms. Sheinbaum has condemned the attacks on civilians, called for a ceasefire, and said she supports a two-state solution. It remains to be seen how, as president, she will navigate Mexico's position on the war, an increasingly contentious issue in the country. Just last week, pro-Palestinian protesters clashed with police outside the Israeli embassy in Mexico City, and Mexico's government moved to support South Africa's case at the International Court of Justice, accusing Israel of genocide. Now, so far, her biography makes her sound unquestionably linked to global communism, to the agenda of the global regime. She was raised into it. Now, the Times article refers repeatedly to Claudia Sheinbaum as Ms. Sheinbaum, but she is married. This is her second marriage. She's married to a man named Jesus Maria Tariba Unger, who is a financial risk analyst at Banxico, otherwise known as the Bank of Mexico, the Central Bank of Mexico. So Mexico's president-elect is married to a banker at Mexico's central bank. Now, again, all of these are indicators, potentially at least, of her political leanings, her political allegiances. She's an avowed leftist, as was her mentor, AMLO, before her. But Donald Trump says plenty of good things about AMLO. Sheinbaum thanked her husband in a post on X, formerly Twitter, the other day, saying gracias a Jesus, which people took to mean that she was thanking Jesus Christ. Was she doing that to win favor with Mexico's Catholics and Christians who represent almost the entire population? Oh, what a scandal. Except her husband is literally in the picture with her. Was she trying to pull a fast one, or was she just thanking her husband? There were even members of the Jewish community saying that Sheinbaum wasn't Jewish enough because she thanked Jesus, except she thanked Jesus. It's all very confusing. And it's worth remembering that whenever we are looking at geopolitics, it is always going to be confusing. We are receiving stories about these faraway foreign lands. We are not experts on what's actually happening in these foreign lands, and the people who are experts on what's happening in these foreign lands can generally be assumed to be propagandizing us on behalf of the global regime and its agenda because of their own allegiances with that cause. So it's important to remember that the point of all this is not to figure out whether or not this person is a good person or a bad person based on their identity characteristics or their biographical background. We want to know those things because the more information we have, the more we can see patterns as they emerge and they map onto reality. But we don't need to figure out whether or not we want these people to be our best friends. She's Mexico's president, not ours. I'm more concerned with whether or not their elections are legitimate and what she intends to do about drug trafficking and human trafficking and foreign affairs, and whether or not she intends to attempt to subvert Donald Trump in his next term as president on behalf of the global regime, than I am about deciding whether or not I like her. She's consistently discussed as AMLO's hand-picked choice. This is his protege. This is who he wanted to follow him. And Donald Trump has said countless times about AMLO, yes, he's a socialist, but he's my friend and he's doing the right things. And keep in mind what we've discussed countless times, Donald Trump is always mid-negotiation. He could be completely at odds with another foreign leader. But if he and that foreign leader have come to an understanding and he needs that foreign leader to do something for him, he's not going to go out there and show up that foreign leader and insult that foreign leader and diminish that foreign leader because he needs that foreign leader to do what he or she agreed to do. Trump doesn't have to share all of his priorities with these foreign leaders in order to say nice things about them. He only needs to have reached an understanding. But let's leave who she is aside for a bit and talk about this election in particular. And let's start with a particular form of election manipulation that we thankfully don't have to talk about a whole lot. This is from Reuters on May 31st. Mexican candidate assassinations hit grim record ahead of Sunday's election. Mexico's election is now the bloodiest in its modern history after a candidate running for local office in central Puebla state was murdered on Friday at a political rally, taking the number of assassinated candidates to 37 ahead of Sunday's vote. 37 assassinations, we are told, in Mexico in this election cycle. They keep records on the number of assassinations. Jorge Huerta Cabrera, a candidate who was running for a council seat in the town of Izúcar de Matamoros, was gunned down in the attack, according to the state prosecutor's office. The killing takes the number of assassinated candidates in the 2024 election to 37, one more than during the 2021 midterm election when 36 candidates were killed. according to data from security consultancy Integralia. The issue of violent crime has emerged as one of the top issues in this year's presidential contest, in which the ruling party of outgoing President Andrés Manuel López Obrador has been forced to defend a persistently high murder rate, as the opposition has sought to use the bloodshed to argue for change. Ruling party hopeful Claudia Sheinbaum is widely expected to win Sunday's vote and become Mexico's first female president. It's possible that violence is being used as a means to define the election in advance, particularly when certain interests are perceived to be at risk in the event that a particular political project triumphs, said Armando Vargas, an Integralia researcher. The consultancy has also counted 828 non-lethal attacks on candidates during the current election season, up from 749 since just Monday. And I am assuming that these are actual physical attacks and not the sort of attacks described by our uniparty officials and media, where they count mean words online as death threats. Analysts point to Mexico's mix of powerful drug cartels and often corrupt local governments as contributing to the dangers faced by the candidates. Earlier this week, a local mayoral candidate in southern Guerrero State was gunned down at point-blank range during a campaign rally. He was among 560 candidates and election officials who have been given security guards by the government due to persistent threats. Friday's grisly assassination was captured on video, with mayhem erupting at the rally after shots rang out. The New York Times also covered the spate of Mexican assassinations ahead of the recent elections. This is from May 25th. Why are so many Mexican election candidates getting killed? And we won't go through the whole thing, but you can find it in the info stream on Telegram, t.me/veryreasonable. The link will be in the description of the podcast. And you should have no problem seeing that no matter how you are consuming this. Across Mexico, dozens of candidates, their relatives, and party members have been targeted in violent attacks ahead of next month's general election, which will be the country's largest election ever in terms of voters and seats. The surge in violence plaguing Mexico can largely be traced to local criminal groups, according to security analysts and law enforcement officials. The fracturing of Mexico's larger organized crime syndicates has given rise to rival gangs locked in fierce battles for power and territory. In their quest for dominance, these gangs have resorted to co-opting and intimidating the authorities to exert control over communities, an attempt to secure protection, obtain valuable information, and grow their operations. A sharp increase in violence during elections is not unusual in Mexico. In the last election cycle in 2021, when voters across the country cast ballots for more than 19,900 local posts, at least 32 candidates were killed, according to a study published by the College of Mexico. It's about warning other candidates to lower their profile, a reminder that they're not in charge, said Manuel Perez Aguirre, a political scientist who wrote the study, and also to citizens, so they know there's someone watching. It's a democracy, but it's a surveilled democracy. Ah, yes, very democracy. The expanding violence can also be attributed, in part, to the scale of the election and the vast number of candidates, with over 20,000 local positions up for grabs and more than 600 at the federal level. This year's election is the largest in Mexico's history. The New York Times asks, why are candidates being killed? It's hard to pinpoint exactly why certain candidates have been targeted. Many of the political assassinations from the past year and previous election cycles remain unsolved. Officials say a few killings were more criminal or personal in nature, a car theft gone wrong, a fight with a family member that ended tragically. Oh, very thorough explanations. But the Times found that there was suspected involvement of organized crime groups in at least 28 of the 36 killings in this campaign season, according to statements by local law enforcement authorities, party leaders, and local news coverage. Heightening the sense of terror, not only candidates but their family members are being targeted, with at least 14 such relatives killed in recent months. For cartels, influencing politics is done most effectively at the local level. Structurally, it is the most vulnerable, the weakest, the one with the least resources, the one with the least institutional strength, said Arturo Espinosa, the director of Electoral Laboratory, a Mexican research group focused on democracy, which has so far documented 272 cases of election violence across the country, including killings, threats, abductions, and attacks. The trend speaks to the aims of organized crime groups to become de facto rulers of towns across Mexico, mostly for economic reasons. It's about being able to infiltrate municipal governments, capturing government resources, having access to information that is crucial to their operation, seizing control of security forces, said Sandra Lay, a security analyst with the public policy group Mexico Evaluates. It's amazing that all of these very expert pro-democracy groups and think tanks can't figure out whether or not there's something in common with all these killings. In response to the killings, the country's electoral agency has coordinated with federal forces, like the Army and National Guard, to provide protection to candidates who request it. This past week, Mexican officials said that security forces were providing protection to 487 candidates. State governments are also deploying state and municipal police officers to keep dozens of local candidates safe. But a lack of resources, bureaucratic hurdles, and a weakened local police have made it difficult to keep organized crime at bay. Many of these authorities have been left vulnerable, Ms. Lay said. So let's return to the assassinations, the violence, the cartels in just a minute. But first, Reuters, February 22nd, 2023. Mexico passes electoral overhaul that critics warn weakens democracy. Now, whenever Reuters is telling us that critics are warning about weakening democracy, we should translate that as the global regime is upset about election integrity efforts. We have seen this language plenty of times. We know exactly what it means. Their democracy worldwide can only be maintained when their election system is maintained. They have to steal elections because otherwise no one wants to see their country, their nation subsumed into the one world international liberal rules-based order, which even according to the supporters of that system is crumbling before our eyes. So this is Reuters from last February. Mexican lawmakers on Wednesday approved a controversial overhaul of the body overseeing the country's elections, a move critics warn will weaken democracy ahead of a presidential vote next year. President Andrés Manuel López Obrador argues the reorganization will save $150 million a year and reduce the influence of economic interests in politics. But opposition lawmakers and civil society groups, there's another key word, have said they will challenge the changes at the Supreme Court, arguing they are unconstitutional. Protests are planned in multiple cities on Sunday. The Senate approved the reform, which still needs to be signed into law by López Obrador, 72 to 50. The changes will cut the budget of the National Electoral Institute, cull staff, and close offices. The INE, this is the National Electoral Institute, has played an important role in the shift to multi-party democracy since Mexico left federal one-party rule in 2000. Critics fear that some of the progress is being lost in a pattern of eroding electoral confidence, also seen in the United States and Brazil. López Obrador has repeatedly attacked the electoral agency, saying voter fraud robbed him of victory in the 2006 presidential election. The head of the INE, Lorenzo Cordova, has called the changes a quote-unquote democratic setback that put at risk, quote, certain trustworthy and transparent, end quote, elections. Proposed, quote-unquote, brutal cuts in personnel would hinder the installation of polling stations and vote counting, Cordova said. The changes, dubbed Plan B, followed a more ambitious constitutional overhaul last year, that being 2022, that fell short of the needed two-thirds majority. That bill had sought to convert the INE into a smaller body of elected officials. So AMLO was trying to reform the central organizing body of Mexican elections, and his reforms were opposed by civil society groups. And let's go to Wikipedia. In the entry for the Instituto Nacional Electoral in 2022, President AMLO proposed a reform that would require INE officials to be elected by vote. He contends that the proposal would, quote, allow citizens to select honest people to run elections, end quote. The idea is opposed by academics and non-governmental organizations, viewing it as a way to politicize the body, with parties steering their supporters to vote for particular candidates for the board. In June 2023, Mexico's Supreme Court blocked the proposed changes. So we have civil society groups, lawmakers, academics, and non-governmental organizations all opposing the reforms of this centralizing election authority in Mexico. While AMLO, the socialist and Claudia Sheinbaum's mentor, is for them. And Trump says good things about AMLO. Now, if you're going to put AMLO against academics, lawmakers, civil society groups, and non-governmental organizations, I'm taking AMLO, the socialist, every time. I guess we can consider that there are some good lawmakers out there, but in terms of non-governmental organizations, civil society groups, and academics, we should assume going in that all of those are captured. So let's return to the prior subject, the violence, the assassinations, etc. This is CNN, Friday, April 12th, 2024. In Mexico's supersized election, a wave of assassinations has put democracy itself in the crosshairs. Again, we're not going to go through the whole thing. You can find this on Telegram, t.me/veryreasonable. An estimated 70,000 candidates have stepped forward to participate in the June 2nd election, where Mexicans will vote to fill more than 20,000 positions, including the national presidency and the governorships of 9 states. Most of the violence is centered on local races, where voters will choose a municipal president, a role akin to a mayor with broad control over their communities, managing the distribution of tax revenue and access to natural resources, and often commanding the local police forces. In municipalities carved out of cartel hotspots, where the gangs run drug trafficking routes and infiltrate the production of cash crops, the seats have grown into the primary entry point for corrupt influence, experts say. Candidates from across the political spectrum have been killed, but most were running with the Morena Party, which was founded by Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador. As attacks on political candidates have mounted, Mexican leaders have vowed swift prosecution and rolled out an effort to shield endangered candidates with armed escorts. But analysts and party officials warn that the violence has already chilled some campaigns. Dozens of candidates across multiple states have backed out of their races, fearing for their lives. The center-right party, part of the National Opposition Coalition, is now on a quote-unquote forced march, trying to enlist candidates in the state, according to Guillermo Valencia, who is the head of the Institutional Revolutionary Party. It has been left to abandon some races altogether, where it cannot find a willing candidate. I try to offer them security, but it's pretty much useless. We are in a state of defenselessness, Valencia said. The criminal groups are getting away with it. Throughout the campaign, López Obrador has largely downplayed the wider significance of the attacks, arguing that his administration has driven homicide rates down. Asked if he viewed the increase in electoral violence as a threat to Mexican democracy in a 60 Minutes interview, López Obrador demurred, saying, generally they all participate. There are many candidates from all the parties. But in some of the country's most rural reaches, where organized criminal gangs are at their most powerful, cartel-favored candidates have won races unopposed. In Hilotlan, a town of 10,000 in the shadow of the Jalisco New Generation cartel, the last election cycle was essentially canceled. After receiving threats from local gangs, 2 of the 3 candidates for mayor in 2021 dropped out of the race. The remaining candidates' uncontested victory was later annulled by a federal elections court. The election of Hilotlan de los Dolores, Jalisco, does not meet the conditions of a free and authentic election because the insecurity generated by organized crime in that municipality had a double effect, generating non-competitive elections and limiting the vote of the citizen, the court said, upholding an earlier ruling. An interim council now runs the town, albeit with few of the powers of a regular government. According to Marcos Francisco del Rosario Rodriguez, the director of the Department of Sociopolitical and Legal Studies at Universidad Jesuita de Guadalajara, criminal groups have filled the void in Hilotlan, providing jobs and services to the community. The article notes that an election is planned for this year, but the return of an official government isn't guaranteed. Now, again, unfortunately, we can't take any of this at face value. Cartels, gangs, and terrorists are all in the same category and are all elements that are used by the global regime in their efforts to destabilize and delegitimize countries and governments who are not playing their part in the advancement of the global regime's agenda. And that's the real key. It's not about the politics practiced in a given country or by a particular political candidate, at least not in terms of left-right ideology as it's described by global state propaganda media, which does not even constitute an accurate description of the political spectrum in the first place. And again, I'm not suggesting that doesn't matter. I'm not suggesting that various politicians, including the Mexican ones in this discussion, are not actually leftists, but it really is only about whether or not they are going along with the global agenda, or whether they are actually looking after the needs of their country and their people. And cartels, gangs, and terrorist groups certainly sound terrible and are portrayed as terrible. But then again, the real ones are often set up, funded, armed, and run by the same global regime and its intelligence apparatus. Consider how they portrayed the gangs in Haiti, or the so-called juntas in Myanmar and across Africa. Despite their constant concern about the delegitimization of election processes here in America and around the world, they have no problem delegitimizing election processes when things aren't going their way. They don't even recognize the elections, the referenda in that eastern portion of Ukraine, all of which are now just part of Russia and voted for Russian President Vladimir Putin, another election that is totally illegitimate in their eyes, just based on loose claims that Vladimir Putin controls absolutely everything. So again, we're left with a lot of claims, a lot of information, and it's very difficult to come down on one side or the other. This is Fox News, May 20th, a couple weeks ago. Most ruthless Mexican cartels operate in all 50 states, bring turf wars to U.S., according to the DEA. The article is about a recent national drug threat assessment from the DEA. The report is linked in this article. Again, we're not going to hit the whole thing. The deadly reach of the Mexican Sinaloa and Jalisco cartels into U.S. communities is extended by the wholesale level traffickers and street dealers bringing the cartel's drugs to market, sometimes creating their own deadly drug mixtures, the DEA report says. Together, the Sinaloa and Jalisco cartels have caused the worst drug crisis in U.S. history. If you're unfamiliar with Mexico, by the way, Sinaloa and Jalisco are states in Mexico. Skipping down in the article. Sinaloa and Jalisco have, quote, effectively eliminated any competition in U.S. markets and, quote, dictate the flow of nearly all illicit drugs, end quote, into the country, according to the report, which notes that thousands of cartel-linked dealers currently operate in the U.S. Skipping down again. An undercover law enforcement operation also busted the cartel members, arranging a weapons smuggling operation into Mexico, including 50 caliber high-powered rifles, court documents allege. During the investigation, the DEA seized about 21 kilograms of pure fentanyl, 70,000 rainbow-colored fentanyl pills, 3,000 M30 blue fentanyl pills, 243 pounds of crystal meth, 2 kilos of cocaine, and 24 guns, including 18 rifles and 6 pistols. Man, is cocaine losing popularity or something? In late April, 12 traffickers tied to the Jalisco cartel were sentenced to 4.5 to 40 years in federal prison after they were busted in Del Rio, Texas, in 2021 for coordinating a shipment of nearly 200 kilograms of liquid methamphetamine worth $9.9 million. In the letter from the administrator, Ann Milgram, attached to the DEA's drug threat assessment, she says, the Sinaloa and Jalisco cartels are at the heart of this crisis. These two cartels are global criminal enterprises that have developed global supply chain networks. They rely on chemical companies and pill press companies in China to supply the precursor chemicals and pill presses needed to manufacture the drugs. They operate clandestine labs in Mexico where they manufacture these drugs and then utilize their vast distribution networks to transport the drugs into the United States. Oh, wow, they do that right alongside their human trafficking operation, which is part of the global regime's criminal enterprise. They rely on associates in the United States to distribute the drugs at a retail level on the streets and on social media. Finally, the cartels utilize Chinese money laundering organizations to move their profits from the United States back to Mexico. Drug trafficking organizations based in Mexico and South America are increasingly utilizing China-based underground banking systems as their primary money laundering mechanism. In response to these threats, the DEA has acted urgently to target the criminal networks responsible for the influx of synthetic drugs into the United States. Are they talking about Pfizer? No, probably not. Pfizer is one of the legal drug cartels. Returning to the article from Fox News, Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador and his administration have routinely denied or downplayed cartel violence and criminal activity. He omitted any reference to drugs, crime, or the cartels during his September 2023 State of the Union address. He also said last March that his government was, quote, not going to permit any foreign government to intervene in our territory, much less that a government's armed forces intervene, according to Al Jazeera. So let's recap a bit. We have Trump on AMLO's side, or at least he says nice things about AMLO. He's a socialist, but he's my friend. He's the kind of guy that Trump can work with, at least. They're mid-negotiation, at least. Or maybe it's just that Trump is willing to say nice things about him because he needs something. Opposed to AMLO's electoral reforms of the past are academics, non-governmental organizations, and civil society groups. AMLO had actually claimed multiple times in the past that his electoral defeats were due to election fraud and manipulation. But of course, we've seen both sides claim that before. There is election manipulation happening in this particular Mexican election, centered around an extraordinary amount of violence directed at candidates themselves, their families, people associated with them. And we're told that's happening primarily at the local level, primarily involving these gangs and cartels. At least that's what we're being told by global establishment media organizations. AMLO is denying and downplaying the problems, but it must be real because the immigration problem and the drug trafficking, the weapons trafficking, the human trafficking, all of that remains a problem. At least everyone seems to agree that it remains a problem. Now, it's possible that it was a problem in the past and it's no longer a problem, but it's still being exploited as a current problem for political gain. But it's hard to know what's what anymore. This is NPR, American state media. From April 22nd of this year, Mexico's leading presidential candidate is stopped by masked men at checkpoint. Mexico is a country in the middle of a deadly turf war between rival cartels and government security forces. One of the symbols of that turf war are checkpoints. Sometimes they are run by municipal police or the military. Other times they are run by mysterious masked men. They usually ask you a few questions, take a few notes, and you're off to your destination. On Sunday, Claudia Sheinbaum, the leading presidential candidate in Mexico, was stopped at one of those roadblocks by a group of men covering their faces with ski masks. In the video of the encounter, Sheinbaum, a frontrunner in the polls, looks on as one man tells her, "When you get to power, remember the mountains, remember the poor people. That's all we have to say. We are not against the government. We are here so you see the disaster that is Comalapa." Comalapa is a small town in Chiapas, a state in southern Mexico that borders Guatemala and used to be relatively peaceful. But as Mexico's two biggest organized crime groups, the Sinaloa cartel and the Jalisco New Generation cartel, have tried to extend into new territory, their fighting has brought chaos to Chiapas. So, who were those mysterious people in masks? Latinos, an online news site that was there when it happened, says they are autodefensas, armed citizens who patrol their communities. Strange that an online news site was there as the leading presidential candidate was stopped while driving by masked men, but perhaps they were simply traveling with Sheinbaum. In comments to the press, Sheinbaum did not clear up anything. Instead, she intimated this was staged by her moneyed opponents. They said they were villagers, that they weren't hoity-toities. They call these fifis, by the way. It's all very strange, Sheinbaum said. One reporter points out that some of the villagers told them the masked men were in fact members of the Sinaloa cartel. "I don't believe it," says Sheinbaum. In his morning briefing, President Andrés Manuel López Obrador downplayed the incident. "This is propaganda," López Obrador said, adding that the masked people had very likely been planted by political enemies. "The incident will be investigated," the president said, but he said it was not, quote unquote, very serious. But the encounter at the checkpoint reveals the tenuous security situation in the country. As the cartels fight for territory and power, they have turned parts of Mexico into some of the most violent places on earth. And the violence has not spared politicians. This political season alone, 17 candidates have been assassinated. 2 mayoral candidates were found dead just last Friday. So far, according to the Associated Press, the government has offered police protection to 250 candidates. And again, this is about 2.5 months old. So the numbers have essentially doubled since then. Tiziano Breda, who studies political violence in Mexico at the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, says it's hard to see an incident like this as anything but a threat to Mexico's leading presidential candidate. The government of López Obrador, he says, has customarily dismissed incidents like this because if it admits that organized crime or some other group is trying to intimidate Mexico's leading presidential candidate in such a crass way, it would be a tacit acknowledgement that, quote, things are really out of control, end quote. It means that the government hasn't been able to rein in organized crime and has actually somehow allowed it to grow even further to this level, he said. Sheinbaum, whose wide lead in opinion polls puts her on track to become Mexico's first woman president in the June 2nd elections, campaigns without much security. Her campaign has mostly skirted the violence afflicting Mexico and focused on the social programs that have made the current president hugely popular. Her opponent, Xochitl Gálvez, has focused on security. Her campaign slogan is, "For a Mexico without fear." So we're being told that the president-elect of Mexico, Claudia Sheinbaum, a couple of months ago, she was stopped in her car by masked men who may or may not have been part of the Sinaloa cartel. People are claiming that they were, but Sheinbaum and AMLO are denying that problem or covering up that problem. And the opponent, Gálvez, wants to make it clear that security is a major issue. In fact, that was the pillar of her campaign. Let's bring things back to America. This is from the Chicago Tribune yesterday, June 3rd. Thousands of Mexican nationals in Chicago turn out to vote, some waiting over 10 hours. Thousands of people in Chicago are voting in a Mexican election? Way before 5 a.m., people eager to cast a vote for the Mexican presidential election began to form a line outside the Mexican consulate in Chicago. By noon, thousands of people took over South Ashland Avenue, forcing police to close off streets and set up barricades to control the lines. For the first time, Mexican nationals could cast a vote in person at consular offices around the world in a historic election where the country is set to elect its first woman president. Voters will decide whether Claudia Sheinbaum, aligned with the left-wing party Morena, or Xochitl Galvez with the center-right party PAN, will succeed Mexican President AMLO, a populist and creator of the Morena movement. With only 9 voting booths at the Mexican consulate, the process was lengthy and frustrating for some in Chicago, some waiting more than 10 hours, but they were excited and committed to voting. For some Mexican immigrants, the opportunity to vote in person from Chicago encouraged them to vote, many for the first time ever. Others said electing the first female president inspired them to wait in line despite the lack of coordination. The INE, that's that centralizing election body, underestimated our power, our presence in Chicago, said Edith Cortez, who is from Guerrero, Mexico. She has been living in Wooddale for 34 years, but one day she wants to return to Mexico. Though she was frustrated after more than 6 hours waiting in line to vote, she refused to leave. It makes me proud to see so many Mexicans here willing to vote, Cortez said. This shows how hungry we are for a change in our country. We must unite. After all, we've been forced out of our country into the United States by former politicians. 34 years ago. I'd love to know how many times she's voted in American elections. The woman who feels justified in voting for Mexican president despite living in the United States for 34 years believes that a woman president opens the door to create a domino effect of changes in a country that has been so deeply correlated with a macho culture. We are progressing regardless of which candidate wins. We're going in the right direction, she said, referring to Sheinbaum, who has remained the frontrunner for the majority of the campaign, and her opponent, Xochitl Galvez. Lopez Obrador, a populist colloquially known as AMLO, finishes his term as one of the most popular and controversial leaders in modern history after taking the reins from established major parties in Mexico. Sheinbaum, a scientist and former Mexico City mayor, is representing Morena, the country's current ruling party. Her opponent, Galvez, is a former senator representing a coalition of the National Action Party, the Institutional Revolutionary Party, and the Party of the Democratic Revolution. Sheinbaum has promised to continue current policies of expanding social programs for the country's low-income and working class. Meanwhile, Galvez has promised to quell violence and corruption, harshly criticizing AMLO's failed policies to stop cartel violence. Though he remains highly popular, Lopez Obrador has shown himself to be intolerant of criticism and oversight, and his critics say his moves to attack the judiciary, slash funding to Mexico's electoral agency, and expand the military's responsibilities in civilian life have eroded Mexican democracy. The opposition has responded with large protests. To be honest, that sounds like a description these same regime media sources would use to describe Trump, attacking our institutions, undermining various election agencies, concerns about the military's involvement in civilian life. I'm sure we can look forward to more of that. We heard all about it during considerations at various times of Trump using the Insurrection Act to quell actual street violence, domestic terrorism around the country by BLM Antifa. While the claims presented by the regime's allies always sound directed at solving serious problems, they are generally only concerned about achieving compliance with the regime's agenda. The Chicago Tribune writes Lopez Obrador is considered Sheinbaum's mentor, and if she is elected, it would cement his legacy and show that his Morena party can survive beyond his presidency. Now let's move briefly to the illegitimate president here in America. This is the headline from Reuters today. Biden expected to block migrants from asylum at the U.S.-Mexico border. Now, that is certainly interesting timing. The fake president, Joe Biden, is going to, for the first time in his quote-unquote presidency, 3.5 years in, block asylum claims at the border right at the same time Mexico elects a new president. And keep in mind that the immigration portion of Mike Johnson's package did not receive the approval of those who were tasked with judging the quality of Mike Johnson's package. This is from Reuters. U.S. President Joe Biden is expected to sign a sweeping new border measure on Tuesday that would allow authorities to quickly deport or send back to Mexico migrants caught crossing the southwest border if illegal entries surpass a certain level, according to two sources with knowledge of the move. So this is one of the elements that was supposed to be included in the immigration portion of Mike Johnson's package. The measure, which would restrict access to asylum, would take effect when U.S. Border Patrol apprehensions surpass 2,500 a day, the two sources said. The illegal crossings would have to dip below 1,500 a day for the asylum restrictions to be lifted, one of the sources said. It sure is weird that it doesn't have to go to zero. The restrictions are not expected to apply to unaccompanied minors. The White House did not immediately respond to a request for comment. The election year move is expected to trigger legal challenges from immigrant and civil rights groups who have criticized Biden, a Democrat, for adopting hardline policies that mirror those of his Republican predecessor, former President Donald Trump. Gosh, it's like Donald Trump is still in charge or something. Biden has toughened his approach to border security as immigration has emerged as a top issue for voting age Americans in the run-up to November 5th elections, where he will face Trump in a rematch of the 2020 contest. Or at least that seems to be the case right now. For the first 3 years of the fake president's fake term, immigration was not an issue in the media. It was not an issue for Joe Biden. It only came up late last fall when negotiations began, first for the omnibus package, then the 2 minibus packages, then the even tinier packages that spun off that, including Mike Johnson's, I guess, tiny package. Sorry, Mike. We saw all sorts of major television events related to immigration. Everybody got super emotional about immigration. All of the standard issue villagers on the uniparty left and the uniparty right, all of a sudden, realized that immigration was a problem. Even New York City Mayor Eric Adams was out there saying, we just don't have any more room. All of a sudden, we get stories about drug deaths. All of a sudden, we get stories about illegal aliens murdering Americans. It's like the immigration problem didn't exist for a few years and all of a sudden made a comeback, at least narratively speaking, when the regime needed the complicity of the American people to be able to print more money and then give it to all of the people they've promised all that money to already. If the immigration portion of Mike Johnson's package had received approval, we would hear about how the illegitimate Biden administration and the unipartisan consensus in the House and Senate had solved the immigration problem. Biden said he needed the Congress to do his work so that the problem could be solved. Well, the Congress didn't do its work, and now Biden is signing an executive order to solve the problem anyway. It's almost like the problem has been solved, and they're trying to figure out a way to take credit for solving the problem that they had nothing to do with solving, that they, in fact, created and that they profited from. Biden took office in 2021, vowing to reverse some of Trump's restrictive policies, but grappled with record levels of migrants caught crossing illegally. Trump has criticized Biden for rolling back his policies and vowed a wide-ranging crackdown if reelected. In advancement of the announcement, Trump's campaign issued a statement calling Biden's executive order amnesty, not border security, and again blaming immigrants for what he called a U.S. crime wave. Here is where Reuters is the most Reuters it could possibly be. A range of studies by academics and think tanks have shown that immigrants do not commit crime at a higher rate than native-born Americans. Okay. That's irrelevant, but okay. Trump himself became the first U.S. president to be convicted of a crime on Thursday when a New York jury found him guilty of falsifying documents to cover up a payment to silence a porn star ahead of the 2016 presidential election. So you see that? Illegal aliens who commit a crime by coming here and staying here, therefore committing crime at 100% rate, do not commit as much crime as normal Americans. They don't even commit as much crime as the quote-unquote former president who was just convicted of 34 crimes. The new U.S. restrictions mirror a Biden-backed Senate bill that aimed to block migrants from claiming asylum if the number of migrants caught crossing illegally reached a certain level. The bill was crafted by a bipartisan group of senators, but Republicans rejected it after Trump came out in opposition. And you'll remember, I think I might have even mentioned it yesterday, that they actually tried to pin the immigration problem on Donald Trump, who was identified by all of them for years as the man who wanted to build the wall, the man who hated black and brown people, even though they all love him now and he never hated them to begin with, the man they called xenophobic, the man who implemented the travel ban, the man who locked all those kids in all those cages. That man actually caused the immigration problem, or at least he no longer cares about stopping it. Why? Because it's going to hurt Joe Biden. And then when Trump comes back and stops it, it's going to make Trump look good. That, my friends, is a baseless conspiracy for which there is no evidence. They just happen to hate Donald Trump a whole hell of a lot. So Reuters admits that Biden is going to do through executive order what he was not able to do in Congress, despite unipartisan agreement in the Senate. He said he needed Congress to give him the power to be able to solve the problem, and they didn't, so he's going to solve it anyway. It's like the fake president and his fake administration have no idea what's going on. The number of migrants caught crossing the U.S.-Mexico border illegally dropped in recent months, a trend U.S. officials partly attribute to increased Mexican enforcement. This is getting really confusing. Joe Biden couldn't stop the problem on his own before. He needed Congress's help, and the problem was really, really bad. The television was telling us every day how bad the problem was. And Chip Roy, gosh, he was out there every day telling us how bad the problem was. They wanted to be able to solve that problem with the immigration portion of Mike Johnson's package. But they weren't able to get it done. Biden wasn't able to sign it, and Biden took no executive action to stop the problem. But despite that, the problem stopped anyway because of Mexican enforcement. So AMLO would have been doing that. And Sheinbaum is AMLO's protege, the Jewish communist climate activist married to a banker, is AMLO's protege as AMLO stops the illegal alien problem on Mexico's side of the border. Here's how Reuters tries to reconcile this at the end. Claudia Sheinbaum was elected as Mexico's first female president in a landslide victory on Sunday and will take office on October 1st. Biden's border restrictions could put pressure on Sheinbaum, the successor to current President AMLO, to keep illegal border crossings down. Let's go to Politico on Saturday. Claudia Sheinbaum will be Mexico's next president, but which version of her will govern? She's a pragmatist and an ideologue. Which one will dominate? And so this is before the election happened. And the picture that they use of her, it looks like she is taking part in a police lineup. On virtually every corner of Mexico's capital city, drivers encounter political activists holding signs for one or another of the country's political parties. Colorful banners enliven the otherwise gray and white walls of the city's office buildings. The nation is visibly preparing for its presidential election on Sunday. One word dominates on fences and bumper stickers, even in radio commercials: Morena. It is the acronym of Mexico's current ruling party, the National Regeneration Movement, which is set to win in the upcoming election. So the people are dramatically in favor, in a dominant way, of the party started by Mexico's current populist president, who Donald Trump says nice things about. One person dominates as well. Next to the party's dark red logo, Mexicans have grown accustomed to reading the phrase "Es Claudia," it's Claudia, or Claudia Presidenta, President Claudia. Those slogans refer to 61-year-old Claudia Sheinbaum, the former mayor of Mexico City and the clear favorite to occupy the nation's highest office. Thank goodness Politico taught us Spanish. In fact, the contest is all but decided. Morena, with two allied parties, currently holds a majority of seats in Mexico's Chamber of Deputies and Senate. It is also the party of Mexico's current president, who, despite many controversies throughout his tenure, maintains an approval rating well above 50%. Skipping ahead. Millions will head to the polls, and around midnight, the president of Mexico's National Elections Institute will announce Claudia Sheinbaum as the country's next leader and the first woman to occupy the presidency. The real question, however, is what will happen after that. For as long as Claudia Sheinbaum has been a public figure, she has alternated between what people here see as two different personalities. On one hand, she's an accomplished physicist with expertise in environmental science and a reputation for pragmatism. On the other, she's a longtime leftist activist, a close ally and champion of López Obrador, and a divisive figure who came to power promising to represent the lowest echelons of Mexican society and, during his tenure, increased social spending to a historic high while simultaneously attacking Mexico's systems of checks and balances. The question raging here is, which of Sheinbaum's two personalities will dominate? Some think she will be Mexico's Angela Merkel, a scientist by training who will prioritize efficiency over ideology for the nation's benefit. Others see her as a mere puppet of López Obrador, who will follow in his leftist footsteps, increasing social welfare programs and battling the nation's Supreme Court. The truth, in all likelihood, is that she will fall somewhere in between. But how that balance is set, the way in which she reconciles these aspects of her life, will define not only Mexico's future, but what kind of president she will be when it comes to negotiating with the United States and its president. In other words, which Claudia, or a combination of the two, becomes president will have an outsized influence on the U.S. political landscape at a time when immigration, drug trafficking, and trade are all top issues for American politicians. That very much reads like they're saying the Mexican president will be required to do what's necessary to make Joe Biden look good. Mexico already plays a disproportionate role when it comes to the U.S. debate over immigration, and having a Mexican president set on defending Mexican sovereignty and other Latin American countries could worsen the U.S. border crisis during a presidential election cycle. But the implications to the U.S. go beyond immigration. A more ideological and leftist Sheinbaum could easily take a nationalist perspective on drug policy and commerce. She could seek more beneficial terms for Mexico in the USMCA negotiations next year, or be unwilling to cooperate with U.S. authorities to investigate the increased drug trade of fentanyl. A more pragmatic Sheinbaum, on the other hand, could find compromises when discussing trade and agree on a middle ground for investigating cartels with U.S. support without risking Mexico's sovereignty. That means the United States should have a keen interest in figuring out which side of Sheinbaum's personality will govern her interactions with Washington. The article goes into stories of her academic and political background and Mexico's government and how it's changed form over the years, emerging from being what they call a one-party state. The article quotes a Peruvian Nobel Prize-winning author named Mario Vargas Llosa, who called it the perfect dictatorship. Politico says it was a unique form of autocracy. And of course, according to Politico, Viktor Orban is an autocrat. Hungary, therefore, is an autocracy. And Donald Trump, too, is an autocrat. Next year, the United States of America will then be an autocracy. We are told by our betters that if we threaten to tear down their democracy, what will emerge is our autocracy. To which I say, okay, whatever, deal. An interesting snippet here. Politics and activism were never far away. When López Obrador ran for president in 2006, Sheinbaum became the spokesperson for his campaign. When they lost the election and claimed political fraud, Sheinbaum organized protests in support of their movement. That was her MO. Technical when possible, political when needed. Sheinbaum took a break from politics starting in 2006 when López Obrador's tenure in Mexico City ended, and she became mired in a political controversy involving her then husband receiving bribes, allegedly in support of the López Obrador campaign. And let's skip down toward the end. Now, with the election looming, which of Sheinbaum's personalities will guide her presidency is a hot topic of debate. One needs only look at Sheinbaum's proposed government plan to see the inherent tension between her personas. Some of her proposals are truly technical in nature, like creating a program to support women who are victims of violence, or doubling Mexico's rail freight capacity. Others are truly political in nature, such as reforming the nation's electoral institute and Supreme Court so its ministers and justices are elected by popular vote. Both of those were key priorities for López Obrador that he did not succeed in implementing. And as we learned earlier from Reuters, he did not succeed in implementing those because of lawmakers, academics, non-governmental organizations, and civil society groups. So he was opposed in his efforts by elements of the regime, and now Politico is presenting Sheinbaum's continuation of those very same efforts as the quote-unquote political side of Sheinbaum's personality. The technical things are good. They love planning. They love agendas. But reforming their system as it exists, no, that's not good. You see, that's political, and political in this case is bad. Back to Politico as we close this out. Nowhere is this tension more evident than in her proposals for the energy sector. On the one hand, Sheinbaum has been vocal that she differs with López Obrador's reluctance to invest in renewable energies. In fact, proposal number 66 of her government plan is precisely about, quote, supporting an energy transition, end quote, toward greener sources. Yet to do this, she aims to maintain Mexico's state-owned petroleum and electricity companies that have been favored by López Obrador despite their immense debts. So which will it be? A green future or one that invests in state-owned oil? At this point in time, no one can say for sure. And I guess that's kind of strange. We were told she is a leftist, communist climate activist. I thought that's what we were supposed to want. Whichever Claudia, or combination of Claudias, comes to power will determine whether she will seek an open dialogue with the U.S. president or fight with ideological fervor to protect Mexico's sovereignty. Wow. So you're saying there's a chance she might come into office with an ideological fervor to protect Mexico's sovereignty? And I gotta say, I'm a little confused. I thought it was sexist to imply that the first female president of Mexico has split personalities or doesn't really know who she is. And I understand that I don't know that much about Mexican politics, but I thought Politico were the experts. They have no idea who this woman is? Oh, never mind. I mean, it's her fault. She has split personalities. She doesn't even know who she is. It's like they're unclear about whether or not she is under the control of the global regime. And which U.S. president are they referring to here? Is she going to work with the fake president, Joe Biden, or is she going to work with the duly elected president, Donald Trump? They conclude this way. It will determine if Mexico can compete for global investment as dozens of Western companies seek to relocate away from China, or if Mexico will focus solely on domestic concerns. Will Claudia Sheinbaum follow party line views and be guided by ideology, or will she follow her technical past? That is the election outcome that Mexicans and Americans will learn only after the new president is seated. It really sounds like they are prepared to attempt to destabilize and delegitimize her if she doesn't go along with the program as prescribed. They can't say bad things about her because she might end up doing the things they want her to do. And you can't say bad things about her because if you do, you're anti-Semitic. But they also can't say too many good things about her because even though she's a scientist and an activist and a communist and a Jewish woman, she still might not play ball with the global agenda, and that's going to mean that she misses out on all that global investment. The BBC in their coverage on Saturday discussed this exact dynamic in an article with the headline, Migrants and Drugs, Why Mexico's Election Matters to the U.S. And again, we won't go through the whole thing. You can find this article at t.me/veryreasonable. The winner will also have to deal with the record flows through Mexico of U.S.-bound foreign migrants that are a burning topic in the U.S.'s own 2024 electoral race. The scenario is complicated by the possibility of the return to the U.S. presidency of Donald Trump, whose strident positions on migrants and drugs have raised eyebrows south of the border. Mr. Trump has vowed to carry out the, quote, largest deportation operation, end quote, in U.S. history, to remove undocumented migrants already in the country if he returns to the White House. Some Mexican media commentators are calling a possible second Trump presidency the elephant in the room for Mexico's presidential hopefuls. Both Ms. Sheinbaum and Ms. Galvez have emphasized the importance of Mexico's relationship with the U.S., and they have both pledged to broadly pursue good bilateral cooperation. Ms. Sheinbaum, who is running for the governing Morena Party, has vowed to continue with pride the foreign policy of her mentor, outgoing President Andrés Manuel López Obrador. Relations between the U.S. and Mexico during the 6 years Mr. López Obrador has been in power have not been without tension, with disagreements flaring over U.S. counter-narcotics operations inside Mexico, as well as over measures taken by the U.S. on its border to try to control migrants. So Sheinbaum has been with AMLO since 2006, if not before. She is vowing to continue his policies that began while Donald Trump was in his first term as President of the United States of America, when immigration was slowed dramatically. Let's continue. Opposition contender Xochitl Gálvez has called the outgoing government's foreign policy a disaster. She also pledged a, quote, frank, direct, and clear, end quote, relationship with the U.S., which she has recognized as, quote, our most important market. In one of the presidential debates, she reproached the current government for having caved in to then President Donald Trump by agreeing to keep U.S.-bound migrants in Mexico after the right-wing U.S. leader threatened to slap tariff penalties on Mexican goods. She has also said that as president, she would not, quote, bow down without putting up a fight, end quote. However, she added that authoritarian governments like Venezuela, Russia, Cuba, and Nicaragua won't be coming to parade here, end quote, indicating that her government would be less friendly to such overtly anti-U.S. leaders than the current Mexican government and its candidate, Claudia Sheinbaum. And skipping down to the end. Across the border in the U.S., Republican Party candidate Donald Trump has made it clear that he would double down on plans to secure the U.S. border with barriers and troops, even reportedly suggesting he might send kill teams into Mexico to eliminate cartel leaders. When asked about a possible Trump victory, both Sheinbaum and Galvez said they could handle and maintain good ties. President López Obrador, in the end, had a good relationship with Trump, and I don't see why we wouldn't be able to have it as well, Ms. Sheinbaum said recently. Ms. Galvez has also said she was, quote, not afraid of Trump nor of Biden, end quote, and would work with either. And let's conclude with this article. I am clearly, by the way, not going to get to India's elections today. We will find an episode soon to do that. But let's go to one of the global regime's premier propaganda outlets for wannabe elites. This is The Atlantic by none other than David Frum. You might remember I did an episode last fall on a debate between David Frum and Steve Bannon on the subject of populism. David Frum is a raging anti-populist, a massive neocon control freak bent on global domination, as all neocons and Zionists ultimately are. The failing state next door. So David Frum, who is as pro-Jewish, pro-Israel, and pro-Zionist as anyone could possibly be, a man who cannot meet a war he does not like if that war is in service of those causes, is not happy with the Jewish woman Mexico just elected as president. So again, the headline of this article is "The Failing State Next Door." Subheadline: Mexico has its first woman president, but her big win may be a bigger danger to democracy and security. How can you not fall in love with someone who threatens their democracy this way? President Joe Biden's next big foreign policy crisis was waiting for him at his desk this morning, a southern neighbor heading fast toward authoritarianism and instability. This article is from yesterday, by the way. Over the past 6 years, Mexico's autocratic president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, has sought to subvert the multi-party competitive democracy that his country achieved in the 1990s. He has weakened the independent election agency that guaranteed free and fair elections. He has broken the laws and disregarded customs that limited the president's power to use the state to favor his preferred candidates. He has undermined the independence of the judiciary. Not like Joe Biden, by the way, who loves free and fair elections, would never use state power in favor of his preferred political party or candidates, and would never even dream of undermining the independence of the judiciary, even though he does intend to stack the court, and his movement is trying to force 2 Supreme Court justices off the bench, or at least get them to recuse from critical cases. Mexican democracy gained a brief respite in 2021 when López Obrador lost his supermajority in Congress, removing his ability to rewrite the Constitution at will. That respite temporarily reprieved the independence of the Mexican Central Bank and other government agencies not yet subordinated to direct presidential control. The electoral victory that López Obrador delivered to his chosen successor yesterday, 59% of the presidential vote, apparently a large majority of the state governorships, almost certainly a restored supermajority in Congress, concentrates more power in López Obrador's Morena party than any other Mexican government has wielded since the days of one-party rule. So David Frum needs to delegitimize the entire country because there was a vast, overwhelming victory by the party he doesn't like. Frum, by the way, is Canadian. The new Congress will take office on September 1st. The new president will not do so until October 1st. That means that for a month, absolute power over the Mexican Constitution will be in López Obrador's hands. AMLO's successor in the presidency is Claudia Sheinbaum, formerly the mayor of Mexico City. Sheinbaum will be the first woman to head the Mexican state, the first person of Jewish origin, the first from the academic left. These firsts will generate much excitement internationally. They should not obscure, however, her most important qualification, her career-long subservience to López Obrador. Of the 3 candidates within the ruling party who vied for AMLO's favor, Sheinbaum was the one with the smallest and weakest following among Morena's rank and file. Sheinbaum got the nod not because López Obrador wanted a path breaker, but because he wanted someone he could control after his mandatory departure from office at the end of a 6-year term. That is so sexist. López Obrador has built mechanisms to maintain his grip on Mexican politics, including a referendum at the presidency's 3-year mark, which provides a means of recalling López Obrador's successor if she disappoints him and his following. And by his following, I assume that Frum must mean the roughly 60% of the people who voted for him. I mean, he's not calling the election process into question. Even with all of these illegal aliens in America being deployed to vote for the first time ever in Mexico's elections, even if they've been here for decades. Back to Frum. I interviewed Sheinbaum in Mexico City in January 2023. I found her highly intelligent, but lacking in the people-pleasing ways of a professional politician. Most strikingly, she repeated every dogma of López Obrador ideology without a millimeter of distancing. The Independent Election Commission was bad. The elections that López Obrador had lost earlier in his career were stolen from him. The act of replacing impersonal social service agencies with personal handouts of cash from the presidential administration to the poor amounted to a social revolution equal to the other great transformations of the Mexican past, including the Mexican Revolution of 1913. So giving the Mexican people cash is bad, but paying all sorts of groups and organizations to help those people is really, really good. López Obrador repeatedly described the 2024 election not as a choice among candidates, but as a referendum on his record. He used every instrument of the state to win that referendum. The most important of those instruments was the selective deployment of violence. The 6 years of the López Obrador presidency have been the most violent of Mexico's modern history. We cannot know the exact number of those killed because López Obrador destroyed the independence of the National Statistical Agency. I cannot wait until Frum is having meltdowns at Donald Trump destroying the National Statistical Agencies here in the United States. Crime numbers are now often tampered with for political purposes, but a credible estimate suggests that more than 30,000 homicides have occurred in each year of López Obrador's rule, nearly 200,000 altogether. What did he do, David Frum? Did he institute a vaccine mandate or something? Because when I go back in the Atlantic to July 23rd, 2021, I see an article by you with the headline, "Vaccinated America has had enough," and the subheadline, "In the United States, this pandemic could be almost over by now." The reasons it's still going are pretty clear. You see that? COVID? Our fault. Should have listened to our betters, like always. But sorry, let's get back to the article. Violence and death are only a problem for David Frum when they're not advancing the global agenda. The United States, with nearly 3 times Mexico's population, registers fewer than 20,000 homicides a year, and the number is dropping. Only a tiny fraction of Mexican homicides are effectively pursued by the legal system. Tens of thousands of people have disappeared without a trace. It's probably because of the global regime's partners, the drug cartels, and the human trafficking, the sex trafficking, the drug trafficking, and the weapons trafficking. Most of Mexico's killings are not the result of personal disputes or casual street violence. Mexico is under attack from what has aptly been called a criminal insurgency. U.S. officials have long privately warned that the Mexican state is losing control of its national territory, something that Secretary of State Antony Blinken publicly stated in 2023. And there has been reporting over the last few years that the Mexican government does not talk to Joe Biden's illegitimate government, and that includes fake Secretary of State Antony Blinken. When Mexico's security forces clash with a criminal syndicate, they can still win, but typically at terrible cost. In January 2023, Mexican security forces engaged a group of gunmen in Sinaloa. The forces had the advantage of surprise and helicopter gunships. They still suffered heavy losses in the shootout. 10 dead soldiers, 19 cartel members killed, and dozens of people wounded to capture one most wanted man. But in aggregate, the syndicates outgunned the government. What this means for Mexican democracy is very stark. Politicians and journalists in particular live or die according to whether the criminal syndicates believe they are protected by the state. I described last year the case of a prominent Mexican TV personality who narrowly escaped death when his car was riddled with bullets after the president denounced him at his daily media briefing. So AMLO said something bad about a television character, and shortly after that television character was nearly killed. This sounds like AMLO's getting the Donald Trump treatment. In this most recent election cycle, more than 30 candidates for office were murdered, An opposition candidate for mayor in the state of Guerrero was gunned down in front of cameras. Hundreds more candidates have faced threats or in some cases have been kidnapped on both the ruling and opposing sides. So it's definitely true. It's AMLO's fault, even though sometimes it hurts AMLO's party and its political aspirations. On the eve of the election, a Mexican political analyst explained the violence to the Los Angeles Times. Organized crime needs some kind of understanding with the authorities. That may be a kind of negotiation that can be friendly or skirts legality, or involves bribes and collusion, or it can be violent, with threats, extortion, or direct aggression. The criminal cartels want to eliminate politicians they regard as enemies, but they also want to maintain a working relationship with the national government. López Obrador's own relationship with the cartels is murky. In January, ProPublica reported on an internal investigation by the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration suggesting that criminal cartels had likely directed $2 million in donations to López Obrador's first campaign for president in 2006. The horror. López Obrador indignantly denied the story and demanded an apology from the Biden administration for the DEA's assessment. The tougher line pursued by the Biden-era DEA is one reason López Obrador has so openly preferred Donald Trump as Mexico's American partner. He even traveled to Washington, D.C. to praise Trump to Mexican-American voters during the 2020 election, and then delayed congratulating President-elect Biden for several weeks after the election. It's like he knew it was stolen and Biden wasn't the real president. You have to love David Frum and this pitiful global regime, just employing the weakest possible slurs when they know they don't have anything. Biden's DEA said the cartels paid $2 million into López Obrador's campaign 18 years ago. And that's how we know he's a bad guy, while David Frum's allies use their money, power, and influence to maintain the Uniparty's full control over American government and society. These people are insane. But here we go. There's no denying that López Obrador has close personal relationships with important traffickers. Also in 2020, he visited a dusty mountain town in Sinaloa to pay respects to the mother of the drug lord known as El Chapo. When, that same year, the U.S. arrested a Mexican general and former defense minister on drug trafficking charges, López Obrador publicly suggested and privately threatened to withhold anti-drug cooperation unless the man was let go. Having then secured his release, López Obrador decorated the general at a public ceremony. It cracks me up when these people's plans fail and they have to explain and reframe everything. López Obrador came to power in 2018 with a huge mandate that he won in a free and fair election. Sheinbaum comes to power via an election that was free, but not so fair. Because she lacks López Obrador's charisma and popular appeal, her survival will depend on whether she can tilt the rules even more radically in favor of the ruling party. Now, that is for sure sexist that this woman is going to do that because she lacks charisma. And it is also extremely anti-Semitic for David Frum to accuse this Jewish woman of unduly manipulating the system to increase her own power. That is the basis for all anti-Semitic claims, as far as I know. In her campaign speeches, Sheinbaum committed herself to a highly contradictory program to please all political factions. So basically, she's just lying for politics' sake. She vowed more welfare spending, but also more fiscal discipline. She promised to respect the independence of the central bank while remaining faithful to the López Obrador vision of consolidated power. She expressed desire for warm relations with the United States while also rejecting crackdowns on organized crime in favor of addressing the causes of crime. If that program runs into trouble and she gets her supermajority, Sheinbaum will have the means to suppress opposition and dissent. It's worth noting that David Frum is a prominent member of the Aspen Institute and was also part of the Transition Integrity Project. The Aspen Institute was involved with government, non-governmental and civil society group-oriented efforts to censor Americans, to combat mis, dis, and malinformation. But despite obviously being in favor to use all the tools of government to suppress opposition and dissent, David Frum would never support the suppression of opposition and dissent. He is well aware that any politician, anyone doing that sort of thing or advocating for that sort of thing is very, very bad and should not be allowed anywhere near the levers of power or influence, unless they're going to help David Frum and the global regime. A Mexico that is losing its democracy will also continue to lose authority to the criminal syndicates. For Americans, the big question is, how much authority can the Mexican state lose before it fails altogether? How much you want to bet in the next year David Frum is going to be arguing in favor of war with Mexico? The fundamental paradox of Mexican society is this: the presidency is too strong, the state is too weak. A president he doesn't like means the president is too strong. He says the state is too weak. What kind of sociopath would ever say the state is too weak? But let's finish this out. Lopez Obrador aggrandized the presidency still more and thus weakened the state even more. Now this powerful presidency will be occupied by a protege beholden to a predecessor who aspires to control everything from behind the scenes. Is he talking about Barack Obama? The impending power struggle between them can only work to the advantage of the forces of criminality and the chaos that threaten to consume America's southern neighbor. And isn't it crazy how at the beginning of this podcast, we were worried about being anti-Semitic by prejudging Claudia Sheinbaum? And it turns out that David Frum was the anti-Semite the whole time. And Claudia Sheinbaum, to be honest, despite the leftism, seems like she might at least be an okay neighbor. Okay, so tomorrow's live stream will be the later version. We're going to start that at 6 p.m. Eastern. I will be sending that link out to paid subscribers sometime tomorrow. And as for this podcast, I will be back on Thursday at the same reasonable time on the same reasonable podcast network. I don't have a network. Masks and lockdowns don't work. They lied to you about a pandemic. And Joe Biden will never be president.
In my mind, that's the end game.
If you're listening to this episode for free, you can support me and support the show and the work I do by signing up for a paid subscription at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can do so for as low as $50 a year or $5 a month. Comes out to under $0.25 per episode, and you'll blast right through the paywall for all of the writing. The merch store is www.cancelcouture.com, and you can find everything else by heading to Linktree. Linktree.com/I'mYourModerator. And I'll see you soon out on the range. It's